Hello everyone! Today we're going to weather and finish this little tank. We're going to use lots of oils, do a lot of smearing, sponging, speckling and splashing, and it's going to get dirty. We're also doing some rust and covering most of the model in mud. As usual, I broke something and I even made a weathering checklist, so grab your popcorn because this one is going to be messy. Okay, let's dive right into the action. I prepared some dark brown oil paints and let them sit on a cardboard pallet to soak out most of the oils. Since the model was already quite dark, I didn't want to apply a general wash, so I went straight in with a pin wash. The Renault FT-17 is a great little tank, and it has lots of nice details and more bolts than the kit stash of a typical scale modeler. Luckily, most of the details are close together, and since this vehicle is small, the process is rather quick and enjoyable. I started with raw umber, a dark brown color which fits the yellow base coat perfectly and also works well on the green camouflage. Applying the wash was a breeze, and luckily, this time there was no drama. The wash flowed beautifully around all the small details. For the brown camouflage, I would need a darker wash color and use shadow brown. It is so dark, it's almost black. And since the panel lines run through multiple camouflage colors, I had to be creative. Whenever a detail or panel line would cross a camouflage patch, I would simply have the two wash colors meet in the middle. Even if this seems odd, at this scale it's hardly noticeable, and all the upcoming weathering steps will tone it down quite a bit. Pin washing the turret was a bit of a challenge. The thing has so many bolts that before you know it, the whole thing looks like something that was created during kindergarten art class. Anyway, I was too lazy to remove it and decided to deal with it during the next oil paint techniques. For the running gear frames, I used only shadow brown, since this part of the FT-17 would get much dirtier with grease and oil stains. But after applying the wash, I did regret it a bit, since the contrast was way too harsh on the yellow. It would probably have been better to use the raw umber here as well, but I really wanted to move on and trust the process. Now that the wash is applied, we need to do a bit of cleaning, which is an equally, if not more important part of applying washes. There are several ways to do this. I feel like every method is fine, as long as you are happy with the end result. For me, I like to clean the wash with a small brush damped in a bit of odorless thinner. Sure, it costs a bit more time, but it also gives you more control while simultaneously staining the surface to make it look more natural. Highly subjective, of course, but I like it this way. And I think the technique fits older vehicles like this FT-17. I had some glossy patches from the oil paint, but this was no big deal and was easily removed with a bit of the same odorless thinner. And since oil paints take some time to dry, we have plenty of opportunity to fix this. So, no stress. After working my way through the model, this was the result after the pin wash. Maybe a bit too clean, but let's not forget we're only adding shadows at this point. Overall, I was pretty happy with the result, with the exception of the suspension frames. But let's not worry about that. For now, let's continue, since we're not done with oil paints just yet. A few days had passed and my first palette had completely dried out, so I had to make a new one. I always wait at least 2 days between the pin wash and this step, otherwise you risk wiping away all your precious work on the model. I started by adding shadows around important details and other areas of the model that deserve to stand out more. And yes, I still don't have a proper holder to handle my models during painting. No comment. I focused on parts that logically should be darker or where certain elements needed more emphasis. Since the model is super tiny, the hull didn't require much work. I focused mainly on the turret and the large panels on the front. For the suspension frames, I concentrated on the lower areas where shadow and dirt would naturally occur, and in some cases made certain details more pronounced. It helps to thin the paint slightly, which makes blending much easier. For blending, I used a variety of small brushes damped with a bit of thinner. A dabbing motion works well, though in some cases I even removed paint because I applied too much. After letting the thinner dry, I grabbed a completely dry brush to blend everything out, giving that smooth transition we all love. An angular brush works wonders here, letting me hit every nook and cranny while blending the oil paints. And with the shadows out of the way, it is time to give the model some more fading. Yes, another palette. I am not very cost efficient when it comes to paint. Also, I didn't use any of the yellow colors. Since I have to prepare the palette beforehand, I sometimes want to make sure I have everything I might need in a single session. I started by placing small dots of diluted oil paint onto the surface. As with all the other steps, diluting the paint will help later with blending. Also, I am no oil dot Picasso, but I at least try to have the lightest colors on top and the darker colors near the bottom. Since this was my first 3-tone camouflage, I quickly discovered that light colors on a brown base color are not a happy marriage. So, keeping this in mind, I tried to blend the paint more heavily on the darker parts of the model. For the horizontal surfaces, I used the dabbing motion to blend everything. And whenever I came across a slanted surface, I used downward motions. An oil dot filter also helped blend in the decals, which otherwise stand out like a sore thumb. And as the name implies, this technique acts basically as a filter. It changes the hue of the surface, but with irregularities and fading. For the larger vertical surfaces, I used a flat brush and a downward motion to blend all the colors. Like before, I made sure the lighter colors were on top and the darker colors near the bottom. For more irregularities, occasionally I used the smaller side of the brush, and in other situations, added more shadows when I felt the model needed it. After I was done, I blended everything with a completely dry brush. Now, that was a lot of blending, and since we still have our palette ready and the fading technique was still in our muscle memory, I figured it was a great time to add some streaking effect. Don't worry guys, we're almost done with oil paints. I started by placing small bits of paint under bolts, hinges and other random details using different dark colors. Then I used the back of the brush to drag the paint downwards. The brush was lightly damp with thinner, almost dry. It is an easy technique and a lot of fun to do. And you can go crazy experimenting with different ratios of thin paint and how you position your brush. The suspension frames got the same treatment. Again, I placed small dots of paint and dragged them downwards. Lastly, I made a super thin wash, almost like dirty thinner, and speckled it onto the model, making sure to mask the bits I didn't want to be affected. And yes, you can hardly see it. Man, that was a lot of oil paint. For now, we can give it a rest and switch to my least favorite part of scale modeling, which is chipping. I started by making chips in a lighter version of the yellow base color, using the trusted sponge technique. I tried to focus mostly on the edges or places where wear and tear would possibly occur, like here on the hatches, around the turret and the engine covers. But while adding more and more chips, I began noticing that creating light chips on the 3-tone camouflage is a whole different beast, especially on the dark brown camouflage. The yellow chips felt out of place and way too harsh. I moved on, hoping the next step would tone it down. For this build I wanted to get a bit heavier on the chipping, so I started by filling in some, but not all, of the previous applied chips with a dark brown color, implying damage that went through the yellow base coat. For this I used a 000 brush using a dabbing motion. Quite a tedious job, but absolutely worth the effort in my opinion. And whenever I felt more chips were needed, I just grabbed the sponge and added more. And whenever I made a mistake, I quickly removed it using a makeup sponge. Yes, I now know what these things are called, and this time, after much debate, I had to buy my own. I don't want to talk about it. Anyway, I also used the brush in a dabbing motion along edges to add to the wear and tear. Passing halfway through, I couldn't help but feel unhappy with the result. It looked painted on, especially on the brown patches. Because of this, I tried to tone the effect down by adding brown chips, which ironically made it less effective and erased the effect altogether. In the end it looked okay, but I wasn't happy how it turned out on the brown camouflage. This is definitely something I need to improve on. Lastly, I added some heavier chipping to the wheel mounts, which looked really toy-like up until now. Luckily, this turned out a bit better, but since I was a bit disheartened by the chipping, I really wanted to do something else and decided to start painting all the tools and details. For no particular reason, I started with the chains. I just felt like painting them. However, I realized that one bad stroke could ruin the entire backside of the model. To be safe, I added some masking tape, but I decided I didn't want to take any risks and ended up masking the whole backside. It was a bit tedious, but since the chains were already mounted, I had no other choice. And of course, I could not forget my tiny cute custom chains I had painstakingly added to the model. Once the chains were painted, I decided the Renault logo deserved a bit of love, so I painted it in a copper metallic color. I'm not sure if these were painted over during wartime, but I saw it on a restored vehicle, it looked awesome and I just had to do it. After that I painted all the Pioneer tools and the leather straps on the storage box. Now it was time for the exhaust. Most references showed quite a bit of rust and I really wanted to try that effect. And of course, I'd already mounted it on the vehicle, just to make my life more difficult. On my next build, I really have to plan ahead and leave more parts off for easier painting and weathering. Anyway, I started by painting it in a light grey tone. Then I added irregular patches of a heavily diluted white glaze and spread it across the surface. I also added retarder to the mix to help with blending. Since I had that mix ready, I treated the metal parts of the Pioneer tools in the same manner. I actually made a mistake there, but thanks to the retarder, it was easy to wipe off and start over. Next, I added dark brown chips to the exhaust, careful not to stain the vehicle. Since I was back in chipping mode, I added some rust chips to the chains as well. Now that all the details are painted, it is time to ruin them with a rust wash. As you may have noticed, I really like oil paints. I have some enamel ready-made products, but for some reason I never really got into them. But let's get this wash on. I started by adding oil washes with different ratios to the exhaust. beginning with light rust colors and gradually layering in darker shades. From time to time, I let it dry slightly while working on the Pioneer tools, which received a light coat of rust as well. Next, I added patches of various colors, blending them out until I was happy with the result. While that was drying, I started working on all the chips I made earlier. I applied the wash randomly on some of the chips, and after a couple of minutes I began stamping them with a brush damped in odorless thinner. I repeated the same process on the turnstile and the running gear frames. However, I diluted the wash a bit too much here, so it didn't quite give me the results I was aiming for. I ended up building up multiple layers to fix the effect. Although it wasn't the best rust wash in the world, the model at least slowly turned into a better World War I tank. I quickly applied the dark brown wash to the Renault logo and was ready to move on. So we come this far, and the model is really starting to gain some character. Let's switch gears and start painting the tracks. As usual, I cleaned the tracks with a bit of IPA to get rid of all the dust and unwanted grease from assembly. Then I primed them in a dark brown acrylic color and quickly discovered that plastic workable tracks don't spray too well. So it was back to my custom track airbrushing rig. This worked much better. Although, I still had to paint in between each and every link just to make sure I had covered everything. Armor scale modeling is so much fun. I also tried to prime the tow cable, but since I forgot to prime it with metal primer prior to airbrushing, the paint didn't stick and it took ages to paint it. Next, I mixed up a dark grey steel color and repeated the whole process. I was really happy to see that all the sink marks I had to fill and clean in the first episode were gone. Quite rewarding if I say so myself. When I was done, I couldn't help but notice that the brown oxide color had been growing on me. And it was at this moment that I decided to make the trucks all rusted out. I recently came across a live stream of Michael Rinaldi where he demonstrates how to create rusty tracks with only acrylic paints. And since I had the same paint set in my stash, I really wanted to try out this technique. I first tested it on a leftover piece. And man, if I can get this result, anyone can. If you are into weathering your scale models, you should really check out this channel. I will leave a link in the description. So here's my take on the technique. The trick is to start with the lightest color and work your way up to the darkest using a variety of application methods. Like the sponge technique, adding washes and speckling. A lot of speckling. The beauty of this technique is that you can't mess this up. Well, that's actually not true. It gets quite messy quickly, but you get the idea. Anyway, as long as you build up the colors from light to dark and keep everything as random as possible, you're good. After an afternoon of speckling, washing and sponging, I came up with this. Pretty interesting if I may say so myself. Since acrylics dry super fast, I could immediately rub on some graphite on all the contact points of the tracks and give them that final steel look. For this I used a round artist pencil, which works really well for the application of pigments and graphite powder. Now with the tracks out of the way, let's focus on finishing this tiny model. Up until now, things were going quite well, but as expected, nothing lasts forever. For some reason, the model looked a bit washed out, and it wasn't really doing it for me. The colors lacked depth and saturation, especially now that the tracks were on. My guess was that I used too much white and buff during the oil dot filters, and the yellow colored chips didn't help either. So I decided to add a bit more rust colors in strategic places to bring out more of the details and bring the overall tone closer to the tracks. This actually did improve the model, and I decided to speckle the same rust wash over the whole model and suspension frames. And before I knew it, I started rubbing everything with graphite. Way too early of course, but I needed something simple to boost morale. And this was very much needed, since next up was dust and mud, the final stage, which I have been dreading with every build. After months of work, I was going to cover most of it for good. There was no going back. You have to be absolutely mental to airbrush directly over your freshly painted model, but that is exactly what we're going to do. I thinned the dusty color with a ratio of 1 part paint to 10 parts thinner and carefully sprayed the heavily diluted mix onto the underside of the suspension frames. 1 pass is enough, especially on the brown camouflage. The first try was actually quite okay, the second one not so much. You need to be super careful and spray only tiny amounts, and you have to make sure your trigger finger is in shape. The thin coats acts as a base layer for the upcoming dust and mud, of which there will be plenty. References showed that the inside of the trench tail was always covered in dust, so I sprayed that as well. And before I knew it, I had done it. The first step of dusting was done, and it didn't even look that bad. A good start, but things quickly turned against me. I used dry pigments around the turret and on the engine deck, but failed miserably since I forgot pigments don't hold on a satin surface. So I was just moving them back and forth. Then I broke one of the suspension frames because I had removed the return roller bar one time too many. I was able to fix it, but it was tedious and impossible to film. Since the tracks of the FT-17 run over the return rollers, all kinds of dust and mud would naturally fall down onto the lower frame. I added various amounts of pigments, building up multiple colors from light to dark to mimic this effect, but removed all of it the next morning. It turned out way too dark and the fixer had left a sheen on the surface, since I wasn't exactly delicate with the application. Luckily, the frames hadn't sustained any damage during cleaning and they looked as good as new. The only thing I could not repair was my bruised ego. I tried multiple times to paint and weather the tow cable, but every time I rubbed graphite on it, the paint came flaking off. I was so fed up with it that I ended up stripping the whole thing. The only thing that I could do now was to cover the whole model in mud. Well done, Mr. Tactical, you have done it again. Months of work ruined in a single afternoon. Jokes aside, I had to move on and started by making a mud paste from pigments and plaster. But then I had an epiphany. Vehicles don't get weathered in a step-by-step process in the real world. It's all just a random mess. And I realized I was looking at it through the wrong lenses. But now I knew what I had to do. I started blowing a mud paste with my airbrush onto the undersides of the hull, and I was able to hit everything except for the model, but it didn't matter anymore. Next, I began smearing the paste onto the underside of the vehicle, like here on the hull and here on the trench tail. I used different mixes with different opacities and colors and made sure to build up the mud on certain parts. And whenever I applied too much, I removed it with a bit of odorless thinner. Since the airbrush technique didn't really work for me, I quickly found that speckling with a stippling brush works much better. Then I broke something on the suspension bar, but it didn't matter because this happens in real life too. It felt great and I quickly grabbed the suspension frames and began splashing the mud paste onto the parts. I didn't hold back. Occasionally I used the airbrush because it was just a lot of fun. And that was exactly what I was doing. I was having fun. Man, that was intense, but we still need to weather our rusty tracks. I began by smearing a light dust wash onto the surface. And after drying the tracks with a hairdryer, I toned down the effect with a makeup sponge. This little thing turns out to be the most valuable tool on my workbench. Of course, I didn't forget about the inner sides of the tracks, making sure to hit all the nooks and crannies with the wash. I also speckled some of the mud paste I applied earlier to make sure the tracks would integrate nicely with the model. Lastly, I mounted the tracks on the model to make sure everything would fit and began touching up certain parts I hadn't covered earlier. We're almost there. Most of the weathering is done and we only have to finish some little details. And while we finished the last details, I couldn't help but reflect on the whole build. I don't know if you guys can relate, but whenever I begin to lose interest in a particular build, I become a bit careless and do whatever comes to mind. Anything to keep the ball rolling. No planning, no step by step, just throwing everything at it that comes to mind and just getting the job done. And this is actually a great thing. You learn so much more, finish your model, and most importantly, have fun. While the camouflage, washes and tracks worked out well, the chipping and filters were less successful in my opinion. Anyway, did I succeed? Well, I let you be the judge of that. For me, it was more about learning new techniques and crossing new borders. It might not be 100% accurate, but at least my fear of applying mud to a model is gone. Which is a small victory in itself. Do you guys add mud to your models? Or do you like a clean build? Or maybe it depends on the project you are working on. Let me know in the comments. So, what's next for the channel? I started a new build. It's 3 times as big and I will make some small modifications while I'm at it. I also bought some upgrades, but couldn't use half of them. Typical. So, if you made it this far, make sure to subscribe so you won't miss it. Also, I want to try out something new, a deep dive into a technique that was part of the build. I delete so much good footage to make sure these videos flow nicely that it sometimes feels like a waste not sharing it with you. No promises, but it is something that is on my mind. As always, thank you all so much for being part of this journey. I genuinely appreciate all your support and enjoy chatting with each and every one of you. So please keep them coming. I will try to answer all of you. And if it wasn't for you guys, I probably wouldn't even finish my builds. The scale modeling community is without a doubt one of the greatest communities on the internet. And with that, my friends, this build has come to an end and it's time for a new chapter. And remember, whenever you feel like a build didn't turn out the way you wanted, you can always cover it in mud. Thank you all for watching and see you guys in the next one.